started. Julia, let me know when you're starting to record. Okay.
We're there? Okay.
Okay, so let me first introduce Kevin Bell. Kevin is a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He got his MPA degree from the Kennedy School at Harvard University. And Kevin has 35 years of experience in areas of low-income advocacy, energy efficiency program design, and regulatory energy policy. He also has experience with education and sustainable infrastructure, as well as hydrology and resource modeling. He's done research on urbanizing watershed management, power planning, and sustainable water resource policy. And he's worked both in the public, private, entrepreneurial, academic, and nonprofit sectors. Kevin is a co-founder of a nonprofit organization in Santa Cruz called Sustainable Systems Research Foundation, and that's how I got to know him. And with that, I would let Kevin start our second webinar in the series. The next one will be in a month or two. So Kevin, please share your screen with us.
Okay. Before I do that, let me just say, welcome all of you. And basically, this is unrehearsed. So I'd be very interested in what parts of this are useful to you and what parts of it you could do without. I tend to get out in the weeds sometimes. Parts of this are going to be very dense, and I'm including them in the presentation so that they're available to you later to look at if you want. I'm going to try and run through the presentation, and I'm going to have a show and tell in the middle of it. I'm going to try and run through it in about a half hour, so I'll go through it pretty quickly to give us more time to have a conversation and questions. Okay? Does that make sense? So let's share screen. Come on. Hello. Okay. And we there? Okay. So basically, the provost at the college that I work at UC Santa Cruz, and I have decided that we're kind of frustrated with the University of California, Santa Cruz, and set out to start an entrepreneurial nonprofit that takes a systems perspective on some of the wicked problems that we face: energy, water, transportation, trash, housing, food, social justice, climate, and see what we can do to apply a kind of systems approach and mapping of how things work end to end to coming up with interesting solutions, finding the points of leverage in a system where we can apply them, and networking the stakeholders and players in that system to see if we can come up with an answer that is scalable, replicable, or can be used to leverage something else. As far as we're concerned, if you can't scale something up or replicate it in a lot of places, you're kind of winking in the dark. We're tiny. We work more as a catalyst than as a driver in this stuff. And I think what we bring to the party is that we're pretty good at seeing patterns and pretty good at networking in systems that are the right size. And what's the right size? We're in Monterey Bay, Tri-County area in Central California. There's about 1 million people here. It's one of the great agricultural production areas in the world. We have decent renewables. We have social justice and environmental justice issues, not insurmountable. We have water issues, not insurmountable. We have climate issues that could be severe. Again, one of the richest agricultural areas on earth, pretty good renewables, and politically a constituency that's actually ready to do something. In my experience, I've worked on every scale from national policy to small towns, and in my opinion, the right size is large hundreds of thousands to low millions of people to have direct influence through networks and social capital to influence policy on a large enough scale that if it works, you can probably do it in a lot of other places. So part of who we are is where we are, and in terms of size and in terms of aspects. So I want to talk a little bit about this. This ad is from the early 50s. It's about cellophane. Cellophane is the original biodegradable plastic. It's from the 30s. And it was a really big deal when it first hit the market. There's a Cole Porter song about it called You're the Top from the 30s. And basically, within a decade, cellophane was about 10% of DuPont Corporation's sales and about a quarter of their profit margin. And what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to start by talking about the project that we're working on. We've just started. We were starting to get into that conversations, and then coronavirus hit. So this is just about to happen. And we'll let you know how it goes. I'm going to talk about the problem we're trying to solve. And in this case, what we're trying to do is come up with a way to resolve the portion of the plastic, or the portion of the waste problem that is related to food packaging and single-use items, which is a significant part of the problem in terms of volume, and is dominated by plastic. And a lot of the focus has been on plastic recycling. One of the two things that we do that I think is different is we don't believe that's going to work, and I'm going to talk a lot about that. The other feature of what we're looking at is that the focus has always been on either state action from the top or kind of cult of the individual responsibility from the bottom. We think that those models have failed. We're tending to focus more. We think the leverage is kind of in the middle, and I'll talk about that. Talk a little bit at the end about where we've gotten to, what parts of this are really hard, what parts of it are things where we think there's some promise. And I'm going to have a little show and tell in the middle of it before I talk about what some of the alternatives are to conventional plastics. So our working title is Sustainable Procurement Integration Network. It reflects a lot of our philosophy about how we look at stuff. We take a systems approach so basically we're looking at what the problem is that we're trying to solve in terms of what's packaging supposed to do, and single-use items, what are they supposed to do? How does that system work from production through end of life? Who are the players in that system? Try and map the structure of that system and where the power, economic and administrative power centers are, and then build cooperative relationships with stakeholders on a regional scale. Again, because it's big enough to matter, it's small enough that we can that we actually know these people. And basically what we're choosing to do is look at the interface between supplier distributors and the people that are actually going to be using the product and getting it out to end users. So we're looking at plastics manufacturers where we can get access to them, suppliers and distributors where we can get access to them, and linking them with local governments, agriculture producers, wholesalers, retailers, and basically change what the people who procure at a wholesale level are going to specify and buy. And then the other thing that makes this different is that because we think recycling isn't the answer, we're looking for alternatives to recyclables. We're going to have a much heavier focus on reusables and compostables. And let me give you an example of what we're thinking about. Two examples. One is I'm from Seattle. Seattle had a threshold decision about 30 years ago where they were going to build an incinerator. There was a citizens initiative that replaced the incinerator with a commitment to 90% plus recycling and composting, which the city of Seattle has done. And the composting in particular revolutionized the program. I throw anything that is going to compost, food soil, paper, meat, everything goes in the compost bin with my Clean Green. I can walk around the corner to my hardware store and buy compost that is from the compost that I threw into my compost bin. When I walk into a restaurant in Portland, a lunch spot in Portland, they hand me a bunch of stuff on a tray. I eat it. When I go to bust the tray, there is no recycling bin. There is no trash bin. There is a compost bin. It's the only thing there. It's very simple. as an end user, because if they handed it to me, it's going to compost. And I can walk around the hardware store in Portland and pick up the compost. That's the goal for what we're trying to do here. And so, so let's take a look at plastics production. Basically, starting in 1970, Earth Day, if you go from there to where we are now at about 400 million tons of production a year, we have increased our plastics production by a factor of 20. We have produced a total of about 8.25 thousand million tons of plastic thus far. And it's accelerating. And part of the problem is that if you look at a lot of the life cycle analysis that's been done on this stuff, it fails to capture what happens past consumer use. It fails to capture the back end completely. And because plastics are one of those things, you can look at, there's a great Dutch study that compares disposable plastic bags to reusable bags or paper bags. And disposable plastic bags look great right up to when you get rid of them, because the enormous environmental cost of plastics on the back end are really difficult to quantify, so nobody's quantified them. All we've discovered is that they're really big. And the fact that it's a really complex problem, that those costs are difficult to quantify, and that there are so many variants on plastics and plastic products, which I'll circle back to, means that the problem is incredibly complex, which means it's easy to obfuscate, which means it's easy for industry to evade responsibility. And that's the theme that's going to come up a lot. So this is just quickly, we're looking at a 40% increase in plastic by 2030. And a lot of that is going to come from Asia and developing economies, which means that a lot of the high-tech, capital-intensive, complex supply chain solutions in recycling are not going to happen. They're going to be niche solutions at best. And just to make it clear that this is a feature, not a bug. Shell oil does 4 different scenarios for our energy future. And their sky scenario is that's the sustainability option. That's the one where we're going to meet our Paris climate targets. And so this and this is pretty typical for the oil industry. So it's a good snapshot of what their long-term business model looks like. And there's a lot of stuff here, there's a lot of things here this is not going to happen. Either civilization is going to end, or we're going to do something that's different from this. But, and there's a lot here. There's a lot here to go after. But the main thing I want you to look at here is that under their current scenario, little over 5% of their production is going to produce plastics. Okay, and that continues to increase in 2050. By 2050, it's approximately double what it is now. By 2100, it's triple what it is now. Basically, and if you look at this, basically, their actual production of geological fossil carbon doesn't drop by nearly enough to prevent catastrophic climate change. So this isn't going to happen. But what is already happening is the large oil industries are spending hundreds of billions of dollars in new infrastructure to increase plastic production, because increased plastic production is a core part of their long-term business model for remaining major economic players. This is what's going to happen if we don't change that vector. And part of what's interesting about it is a lot of it's packaging and a lot of it is textiles. A lot of the consumer and industrial products don't last very long, so they're short-term products. A lot of the stuff in construction is a type of plastic called thermoset plastic. It's about 10% of production. That stuff is foams, epoxies, generally toxic, generally impossible to recycle. But part of what's interesting to me about this is if you look at this, at the magnitude of these different applications, and then you look at the lifespan of these different applications, there's basically an inverse relationship between what we're producing plastic for and how long that plastic lasts. So short-term plastics are a huge part of the problem. And if you go back up here, it's a recent problem. We were doing a lot of other things as solutions to the things we use plastics for now. And it's basically displaced it because it's really cheap and because, as we'll get to, industry doesn't really like to take responsibility. So if you look at all of the plastic that's ever been produced, this is from a landmark study a couple of years ago that try to do a comprehensive inventory. And the kind of standard talk about what happens to plastic is that we recycle about 9% of it. The problem, this is true for aluminum, paper, a lot of other glass, a lot of other things we do, is that because there's all different kinds of plastic, aluminum, paper, a lot of it gets downcycled, so it's not a circular economy. It's kind of a loop-the-loop economy, and most of the stuff that gets recycled gets used once and then goes to landfill and incineration. It doesn't stay in the economy. And if you look at, in this inventory, how much of it is actually in something that resembles a circular economy, it's on the order of little over, what? Not even, little, maybe 1.25% of the total. This is probably high because what we call recycled, a lot of that went to China before it decided to stop being a trash colony. We considered it recycled. China burned a lot of it. So basically, really, we haven't done that. And here's how that plays out in Santa Cruz. One of the things that we try and do when we change infrastructure or materials is we try to come up with a model that looks like a previous model that worked. And so before we had plastic bottles and cans that were disposable, we had glass bottles that you took in for deposit. In 1972, as plastic started to take off for disposable containers, Vermont passed a law that required a deposit for plastic and aluminum bottles and cans that was equivalent to the deposit you put on a glass bottle. And the idea was you would take them back to your grocery store just like you would a glass bottle. You get your deposit back just like a glass bottle. And the manufacturers are ultimately responsible for dealing with it just like they would be if it was a glass bottle. All of these laws required grocery stores to take them back. None of them were enforced. No, grocery stores don't do that anymore. And in California, that basically devolved to recycling centers. Meanwhile, between 1972 and now, 5 cents a bottle is now a penny a bottle in real terms. And recycling centers no longer exist. In California, they've all mainly closed. And so we end up with a situation like this. This is my recycling bin at my house. There's a sign here in English and Spanish that says it is a crime to take bottles and cans out of this recycling bin and take it somewhere where they'll give you some money for it. And the reason for that is that the municipal waste management agency in Santa Cruz cashes those bottles and cans in. It is a significant revenue stream for that operation. And so we've gone from deposits as a solution to replicate and continue the idea that you bring containers back and the manufacturer deals with it, to a straight up subsidy of failing recycling operations, public and private. Now, the biggest problem that we've got with plastics, and it's a problem with recycling in general, but especially with plastic, is that we have on the order of 20,000 plastic additives. And actually, this is a good point for me to stop and do my show and tell. So let's do that. All right, let's start with polyethylene bottles. This is Ethos water, by the way. If you pay $2.25, they'll give 10 cents to water projects in Africa. This one is what we talk about when we talk about recyclable bottles. And so when Coca-Cola talks about how they're going to go to recycled content, this is what they're talking about. This one has different additives, but presumably we can standardize those things, put them in a high technology sorting system, pull those out. Right now, what they're talking about is recycled content they pick up off the manufacturer floor, but eventually, when they talk about post-consumer content, this is what they're talking about. This is the same material, different additives. It's brittle. I don't know if you can hear me. This is what you see in a lot of the cheaper water bottles. This one has additives that are actually toxic, and these bottles are not designed to be used more than once. So when you're in a developing country and you see people using these dozens of times, they're being poisoned by toxins. I saw this great interview with an industry representative on these where they said, well, they weren't designed to be reused, so not our problem. But the point is, if you put this bottle in with this bottle, you contaminate the Coca-Cola stream for recycling, and this combination is going to get downcycled. So what are some other options? This is one that I was really excited about. This is water in a box. And so I was thinking, great, we have a compostable solution for water. And product design is a really important part of this. It's not something we can influence directly, although we are going to be tracking that, and in the long run, hopefully folding that into what we're doing. I wish I should have been an industrial designer instead of a policy guy. This is recyclable, but it's only recyclable. It's a composite. You can see here. Sorry, see if I can get this up to you. Okay, you can see here that there's a plastic spout on it. However, if you are in a jurisdiction or served by a private franchise that recycles cartons of this type, composite cartons of this type, and there's an industrial process that they use to do that, this is recyclable. In the city, and so I can, if I am going to take the time and I care, I can take the time, go on the web, go to a website, and find out if my jurisdiction recycles these. I don't know how many people are going to do that who aren't already fanatics about recycling, but if I do that, what I find is that the city of Watsonville, which is 15 miles from here, will recycle this. City of Santa Cruz will not. What else have we got here? This one is polyethylene. This one is polyethylene, and you can't really tell the difference, but these are different plastics, different additives. This one has a non-recyclable wrapper on it. So these are contaminants to this. This one is high-density polyethylene. Can't really tell. Whoops. It's difficult to tell without a high technology sorting system. This one is polyethylene, but it's green. It's a different color. It's a contaminant. What else have we got? This is polyethylene, but because it's press molded instead of blow molded, it has additives so that it melts at a lower temperature. If I try and recycle this, and label's the same, if I try and recycle this, it's a contaminant for this. And this, because some places compost, or some places recycle, some places don't. If you look at the city of Santa Cruz response to the collapse of the recycling industry since China decided to stop being a trash colony, they have a master recycler program, and they'll say, these won't work. We have an alternative that is compostable, and I'll get to compostables later, but let's say for the sake of argument that this works. And I said, so how do I get the farmer or the store to use this instead of this? And she said, well, and she handed out cards where you write down your request to your store or your restaurant, saying, this is unacceptable. We think you need to get these instead. Now I'm a restaurant owner or a store owner, and several hundred people have written to me about this. What do? Do I know anything about the distributor chain or the supply chain and where I'm going to get this, and what farmers are going to do this, and how I even know what my choices are? And the answer is they don't know. And if nobody's helping them figure that out, then doesn't do them any good. Finally, single-use items. This is a Dixie plastic plate. It is paper. It is compostable. I'll talk some about the problems with a lot of these, but there's a coating on this, true for a lot of food service items in stores, restaurants, and single-use items like this. I tried to find out what this coating is. It is not available. We do not know what this coating is. And I'll talk some more about that. So that, just to give you a flavor of some of the complexity of the decisions that a consumer and a wholesale buyer who is distributing to retailers and consumers has to try and make and understand using information that is largely non-existent. So let's go back to the presentation. You there? Hello? Okay. I'll just basically I'll leave this for you guys and go to the next thing. So talk about some of the problems with recycling. Let's assume for the sake of argument that that we've got a single plastic with a single set of additives that are known. How that plastic, the characteristics of that plastic are a function of how it's been treated, how it's aged, what's happened to it. This is from an article that's talking about what happens after plastic has been through several process cycles, and you can see the consistency and the color changes. Basically, the plastic is not breaking down in the environment, except into smaller pieces, but it is breaking down as a production material. And so that makes it very difficult to control the quality of your final recycled plastic product. These are some of the common additives: fillers, pigments, flame retardants, heat stabilizers, light stabilizers, plasticizers. A lot of them are toxic. Any of these in any mix of a single type of plastic makes that plastic useless in the original application. Here's another thing. Generally, if you look at this, what's going on is if you look at the top part of a process cycle, making the stuff is relatively easy. And then if you look at the steps in the end of life phase, this gray part at the bottom, it gets really complicated. Even if you are able to accurately separate things into enough bins that you can do something that is sort of like the original use for the product. Now, I'm a consumer. The left is instructions for a town in North Carolina. The right is the latest post-China simple set of rules for the city of Santa Cruz. And let's look at a couple of things. On the left side, pizza boxes, mixed recycling. Seattle, this goes into compost. Here, it goes into mixed recycling. Santa Cruz goes into landfill. Here, in theory, you can put plastic, you can use plastic, you can wrap up plastic bags and put them in your recycling bin. In practice, it goes to landfill in Santa Cruz. In North Carolina, can't do it at all. And so basically there's, between jurisdictions, between vendors, the rules are different. The rules are constantly changing. Santa Cruz has been through about 3 revisions in the last 3 or 4 years. And if you are in a store or a restaurant or at home and you are holding something in your hand, you are going to take about 3 seconds to decide what to do with this thing. Even if it's something that's important to you, you're probably going to guess wrong. And when you guess wrong, you contaminate whatever stream you put that wrong thing into, whether it's landfill, compost, or recycle. Bottom thing is from the state of Washington. And you'll notice that the bottle is missing a bottle cap. In Santa Cruz, you're supposed to leave the bottle caps on. And it looks like in North Carolina, you're supposed to leave the bottle caps on. And if I just suck down a soda, and I'm going to put it in recycling, I'm either going to ignore what the state of Washington is asking me to do, or I'm going to put it in landfill. Another great example of this is single-use dinnerware. PLA, polylactic acid, is a popular, supposedly compostable plastic. I'll talk a little bit more about that. When I get handed a set of single-use dinnerware, I cannot tell if it is a plastic. I mean, sorry, if it is a landfill plastic or a compostable plastic or a recyclable plastic. A lot of times, and I pay attention to this stuff, a lot of times I can't tell. And restaurant to restaurant, it's not just jurisdiction to jurisdiction, it's restaurant to restaurant. I'm going to get a different answer. And unless I have something like a Portland scenario where there is a compost bin, and if they gave it to me, it's compost, I'm probably going to make the wrong choice about what to do with this stuff. Now, so I'm going to move now from plastic to bio-based plastics, because they are kind of the two things that drive this and drive a lot of our policy issues are cult of the individual responsibility, and shaming if you don't do the right thing, even though the right thing is often complicated, confusing, or impossible to discern. And a touching belief that there's a technology skyhook that's going to come down and make it all okay. So the newest one is sustainable plastics. And there is some good stuff in here, but it is a lot more complicated than you tend to think. A lot of it's deliberately obfuscated. And one of the most frustrating things that we've encountered is that it is extremely difficult to find out precisely what different products are. So we talk about bio-based plastics, we talk about degradable plastics, we talk about biodegradable plastics, compostable plastics, composite plastics, OXXOdegradable, OXXObiodegradable. These are all used interchangeably. They are all different. And many plastics that are presented as sustainable plastics have one of these features, but not the features, not the combination of features that make them genuinely sustainable. The one variant plastic that we're aware of that we like a lot because it meets all the criteria that we're looking for is called PHA. I'll talk a little bit about where it comes from. The others have problems of one kind or another. And there's a lot of excitement about how algae and seaweed plastics are going to fix things. I've been to hundreds of websites about how great this is. I have yet to find a still existing company that is actually producing such a product someday. It's kind of like bioenergy, algae for bioenergy. And the problem is some of these sustainable materials are basically worse than alternative. Oh, I had another. I'll show you another thing at the end that I love. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what's going on, if you look at so this corner is. So the top part here is it's bio-based, so it's produced from non-petroleum sources. These are petroleum sources. These are non-biodegradable. These are biodegradable. And there's a particularly pernicious variant here, which I'll talk about in a second, that's not on here. Whoops. So first of all, you've got bioplastics. Now these are conventional plastics, polyethylene, that are polypropylene, that are made from plant sources. And so when Coca-Cola talks about how they're going to go to bioplastic by 20-something, this is what they're talking about. Exactly the same plastics as the ones we have now, just not made from petroleum. Doesn't really change the equation. As I'll show you, it's actually a significant part of the bioplastic production, and as far as I can tell, it's driven by marketing. There are bioplastics. These are from biological sources, and they are biodegradable. And the starch blends is basically cellophane, PHA, PBS, we like those a lot. PBS may have some issues. PLA, I do not consider a biodegradable plastic. We'll talk about that. And then there's what's called OXXOdegradable bioplastics. These biodegrade, but they are derived from petroleum sources. This is PBAT. And I'll show you a product that uses that. And then all of these have blends. All of these have additives. You need to pay attention to the additives. The pernicious one that is not here is OXXOdegradable as opposed to biodegradable. These are a blend of conventional plastics and a biodegradable binder. And they're terrible. And I'll talk about those in a second. So if you look at global production of bioplastics, remember current production is 400 million tons a year. Total global production of bioplastics is about 2,000. So we're talking 2% of total plastics production. total global plastics production. Of that, half of it is bio-based, non-biodegradable Coke bottles, okay? Of the remainder, PBAT, again, biodegradable, derived from petroleum. PLA is the dominant bio-based, considered biodegradable plastic. And it's popular largely because the big producers are using cornstarch. America has had a vast surplus of corn for about 250 years now. And they're always trying to figure out new ways to use corn. That is driven by a lot of the largest corporate agricultural firms in the country, ConAgra, Archer-Daniels-Midland, and there's developing country variants, sugarcane, tapioca. Some of those you can consider waste products. Some of them you're growing on land you could use for growing food. Starch blends, again, that's cellulose. And then there's PHA, which is our current favorite. And as you can see, it is a tiny fraction of what's being produced. In the United States, it's kind of an interesting story because there was a company in the late 2000s that was starting to ramp up for PHA. It was acquired by Archer-Daniels-Midland and basically suppressed. In the fullness of time, it was spun off about 4 years ago to a huge Korean food store company where it's been languishing ever since. Buried in the Archer-Daniels-Midland site, there's a something about how they're going to come up with a application of PHA for agricultural film for covering crops and fields. Not available. Now, I want to talk a little about PLA. The thing about PLA is it is produced by fermenting starch and then extracting lactic acid and producing polylactic acid from that extraction. So it is from biological sources. It is not a biological plastic. And as such, while it does break down on a molecular level, unlike conventional plastics, the enzymes that hydrolyze it into something that microorganisms are going to eat is relatively rare in nature. And it's really more degradable than biodegradable. And part of the problem with it is the certification standards fail to pick this up because they look at the question of whether it is possible for it to break down to a molecular level, which it is. The certification standards uniformly set a minimum temperature of 60 degrees Celsius for a period of 6 months or so for it to substantively break down. Will it break down in the environment in real time? No. Will it break down in municipal and franchise composting technologies that do not reach 60 degrees for months at a time? No. So what happens if you try it in real life? This is a study that the state of California did where they threw some samples into the Pacific Ocean and watched what happened. Morel is the proprietary PHA filament I was talking about, no longer available, made of PHA. Cellulose powder, which is basically wood fiber, predates a lot of petroleum-based plastics, is the control. We have a PLA bag, PLA bottle, and then we have low-density polyethylene film as the control for that. Ocean temperature is something like 30 degrees Celsius. And what happens? Half a year in, PLA and low-density polyethylene breakdown is identical and pretty much insignificant, and PLA pretty much breaks down. So what that tells you is that under normal environmental conditions, better than plastic because it doesn't just break down to microplastics. Biodegradable solution, not so much. Here in Monterey Bay, the sole composting facility does not accept PLA because when they run it through their anaerobic digester 6 times, it doesn't break down. Next, OXXOdegradables. These are the ones that I was talking about, where they blend fossil-based plastic with biodegradable binders. And what happens over time is it breaks down, it disappears. And so if you are a manufacturer, you can say, look, it's gone, no longer in the oceans, in the environment, we're all good. Instead, it's covering the landscape with microplastics and nanoplastics if you're throwing it in compost. Those microplastics and nanoplastics are now in your compost. If you're putting that on your food supply, now it's in your food supply. And we know that there are problems as it gets smaller and smaller. We know that as the nanoparticles get down to a molecular level intact, they are producing biological issues on a molecular level. A lot of those studies have been related to marine environments. We don't have a lot of data on the impact on humans, but there's a lot of reason to believe that it's a serious problem. This stuff is everywhere. The plastics lobby has been very aggressive in promoting OXXOdegradable plastics as the solution. And there's a lot of companies in the United States that are ramping up to offer this as a biodegradable, sustainable, compostable option. Meanwhile, Europe, this is why I love Europe for all its faults, they actually take this stuff more seriously. Europe is in the process of banning OXXOdegradable products as something that they're going to consider as compliant with the their sustainable plastics initiatives. And where are we? We got to do this pretty quickly. So basically, in Europe, this is a resolved issue. In the United States, this is still on the rise. Another thing about PLA, we talk about reducing the carbon footprint. If you're producing it from cornstarch in a corporate farm environment, the carbon footprint isn't any lower. We like PLA. PLA is produced by starving bacteria of nutrients. They produce what is in effect a plastic nodule of nutrient, which you then extract. And so it is derived directly from the bacteria that you're using. There are numerous bacteria you can use. There are numerous sources you can use. You're not relying on starch. You can use waste. You can use oil. You can use stuff that's lying around. You end up with, you can still use bacteria that produce this stuff. When you throw it back into the environment, the plastic is a nutrient. So it is consumed directly and it disappears completely. So great stuff and barely on the radar. The only pure PHA product that we've found so far is that you can go on Amazon and buy is straws. Now, let's go back to that Dixie plate. Another thing that we could be doing is going back to better product design on materials that we were using before plastics came in. So wax paper, plastic, or I'm sorry, wax paper, paper, cardboard, fiber products, bamboo spoons. And that is actually an excellent alternative in terms of compostable products, except that many of those products are coated with basically Teflon, PFAS. Teflon is a known toxin with known endocrine disruptor and toxic effects at a biological level. And when you take, and they're advertised as compostable, so you compost those, you put it on food, now you have Teflon in the food supply. This is a really serious health issue, especially in the United States. And this is something about the biological impacts. Basically, when we're in our review, we've been able to identify suppliers of every one of the kind of food service and single-use products that are fiber-based. We've been able to identify products that won't use Teflon, but a lot of them do. And if you don't know which ones do and which ones don't, then you're going to make a toxic choice. And again, these Dixie plates, we don't know. So that's the background. And I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are right now and then leave the rest of it for discussion, I think. Yes. We started at UCSC by saying, let's focus on the story at UCSC is that all of their recycling is currently going directly to landfill because of contamination. After 15 years and about 6 consultant studies and a goal of zero waste by 2020, they have gotten basically nowhere because they don't really want to spend any money on this. Their focus continues to be on changing individual behavior and shaming. So we thought, okay, so let's get them to change where they get their products from so this isn't a problem on the back end. We spent a lot of time trying to go through, map the procurement chain at UC Santa Cruz and identify who makes the decision about what gets procured. We failed. There is no one at UC Santa Cruz who tracks who comprehensively tracks the procurement chain for the university. So our next step was that UCSC franchises some of their lunch spots with local restaurants. This is a tremendous opportunity because we can go to them, do an audit of the products that they're using, identify alternatives, implement them on campus, field test them with students, and then move that to their restaurants in town, having established a successful process and baseline set of products. We can be talking to other restaurants and stores and bakeries about what they can be doing instead. So that's shown some promise. We looked at compostable standards and their databases to try and identify products. Because those certification standards really fail to capture what we're looking for, we're having to do the long march through that entire product chain, but that's where we're starting from. We've been talking to manufacturers, and again, it's been hard because a lot of times there's some obfuscation. I'll talk quickly about a couple of them that we've looked at. The most promising so far is an Israeli company called Tipa. They are very cagey about telling us exactly what their product is. As near as we can determine, it is a composite of PHA and PBAT, a petroleum-based biodegradable product. Does biodegrade to a molecular level, unless they're totally lying to us, and this is in fact OXXOdegradable. But assuming we can figure that out, PHA is great because you can turn it into something that looks and acts just like a lot of conventional plastic food service products. This is for wrapping chicken in. Only available in lots of hoặc a ton. And we're thinking about trying to put together a deal where we do a bulk purchase through a supplier or directly through Tipa. This one is interesting because if in fact it is what it appears to be, Whole Foods, which is now Amazon, has announced that they're going to go to using Tipa for their film, which gives us some leverage in talking to grocery store chains. Talking to grocery store chains has been interesting. In the United States, there's a niche of grocery stores that appeal to the professional 10%, and who are, tend to be more aware of sustainability, more committed to it, are willing to pay a premium to be able to say that they're that way. And so there are a lot of regional chains around the country that kind of fit that niche. In the north, in Santa Cruz, that's a chain called New Leaf. So our first thought was, well, let's go to them, do an inventory with them, and see what the alternatives are. And so we started asking, and the problem is that New Leaf was purchased by a Portland chain, New Seasons, I think, about 2 years ago. And it turns out that New Leaf no longer makes the procurement decisions for that chain. That Portland chain has since been acquired by the American subsidiary of a huge Korean multinational, which also snapped up Lazy Acres in Southern California, and pretty much every store in that niche, all the way up the coast except for Seattle, which still has a functional consumer co-op chain. So getting to the decision makers is going to be more complicated than we thought. Let me talk about, Tipa. Another product that is interesting is Biophase. This one is a company in Mexico. One of our problems is that a lot of the most promising manufacturers are not in the United States. That adds an extra layer. This one is interesting because they get their biological material from avocado seeds. How much plastic can you make from avocado seeds? Don't know yet, but let's assume it's not a niche. What kind of plastic is it? They won't tell us. As near as I've been able to determine, this is an OXXOdegradable plastic, which is bad, but it is if you go look for it on the internet, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of articles about how this is another technological breakthrough, and it's the answer. If it turns out that I'm wrong, then we'll try and make a connection with them, but it's been very, very difficult to get them to talk about the details. When we try and map out the distribution chain, There's a few large suppliers. There's an interesting overlap here because with coronavirus, we've seen a breakdown of food supply networks. There's some overlap on the retail, wholesale, distributor level between what we're doing with trying to build local and regional sustainable food chains and what those chains look like for producing, for packaging, for food packaging. Those are hard to break, hard to get at. We have talked to some mid-sized and smaller suppliers and distributors. That's promising. We've had some conversations with food producers, small and large. This area produces about 20% of the strawberries on the planet. And one of the big companies, Driscoll, I think we're going to be able to talk to, both for their field applications and for some regional packaging applications. And again, one of the big things about this is food packaging. Right at the end, I'll show you a spectacular example of bad packaging. Institutions are random, working directly with stores and restaurants, working with them. Basically, what do they need? Engaging them in choosing the products, trying the products, evaluating the products, finding out from consumers what products work for them, and then making some choices. I come from an area, I worked in the public sector for a long time in the Northwest. The public agencies I worked for at least tended to work pretty well. The public agencies here tend to be obtuse because, like with corporations, talking about doing the right thing is a lot cheaper than actually getting anything done. And conceptually, it's difficult to have a serious conversation with them. Getting them to commit to the money you need to spend to fundamentally change how you do things, even on a very small scale, it's very difficult to get them to engage. That's it. And you'll get this. You can email me, or I think Adina can tell you how to get a hold of this presentation. But so I'm just including this so you'll have it. But we're going to set up, probably by Monday, I'll have something set up on our website that will be this presentation, recording, an introductory research bibliography with abstracts, and ongoing updates about what we're doing. I would really like to engage with all of you over time in trying to move this and other initiatives forward. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin. And let's open it for discussion. So if anybody has any questions for Kevin, just unmute yourself and go ahead. Or make a signal and I can unmute you.
Well, while you're thinking about that, let me give you one of my favorite bad product design examples. I picked this one up yesterday at one of those upscale stores. So this one is, let me see here. I have to take the plastic label that's been slapped onto the bottom here off to see what it claims to be. Okay, so this is polyethylene. It is that crinkly kind of polyethylene that is going to be downcycled if it ever gets recycled. It's going to contaminate whatever waste stream it's in. It is two different colors. This color is going to prevent it being used for basically anything that's not clear, is almost useless for recycling. It has a non-recyclable plastic label on the bottom of it. These are bonded to each other so that you really can't, I guess, yes, you can separate them. They're both supposedly the same type of plastic, so maybe you won't. They're both contaminants. This one's a worse contaminant. And then this paper tab on the top has another different kind of plastic bonded to it. So we have 5 different materials, none of which are very recyclable, one of which is more recyclable than the rest, all of which are going to contaminate a polyethylene waste stream. So that's not how to design this stuff.
So on this optimistic mode, I see Marco wants to ask. I know Rachel needs to leave in a few minutes. Do you want to ask something, Rachel?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thanks for the really interesting presentation. It's interesting to me because I studied industrial ecology, so it touches on a lot of the points that I've studied academically. And one question that raised for me was when you were talking about the plastics. I don't know if you even explained it at all or, yeah, expounded upon it, but I saw in your visual that you said to make sure it's clean, dry, and something else. And that caught my attention because in one of my courses, our waste and recycling teacher told us that, at least in the case of glass, because of course it has like a much higher heat needed to recycle, it's actually better not to spend a lot of water and, yeah, if you need energy or
Right.
something, cleaning the inside. Maybe just sloshing it out with water, but then that's it. So I'm curious why you specifically mentioned this about plastics, if there's a huge difference. Obviously the heating need is different, but yeah, I just thought the inside, if there was like a bit of food or something on the inside, that would be okay.
Well, that's interesting. Where that sign comes from is that's official guidance from the Washington State Department of Ecology. And I thought it was interesting because it's asking you to do a lot. Because you're melting plastic, basically glass, you're throwing it into a kiln, you're heating it up to 1,000-something degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
So basically anything that's in there is going to evaporate and burn off. Depending on what you're doing with the plastic, a lot of times when you're turning it into frit, you're basically melting it. The temperature is lower, and a lot of the contaminants are going to kind of stay around and interfere with the process. If you've ever seen the movie Plastic China, I assume you have. Oh, if you haven't, you must. I believe it's the documentary that convinced China to stop being a trash colony. And it's basically a unnarrated documentary of a very poor family in the plastic zone of China, taking plastic that's been imported and reducing it to a very low-grade frit that they bag and sell.
Yeah.
And one of the problems that they're constantly running into is that water, labels, anything that's there that makes the melt process more difficult, makes it extremely difficult to produce a consistent product. I think you're probably right that it's less of an issue than the state of Washington makes it, but the fact that they emphasize that as best practice and expect you as someone who cares to take the time to do that with every plastic bottle you use, or to hesitate if you're in a restaurant and you've got a bottle. That's what I thought was interesting about that.
Yeah, so if I may ask a follow-up question, and maybe it's too broad, but then how can we get this message across to people? Because obviously on the consumer end, it's super important, but if even experts like us, I wouldn't say are confused, but there are like conflicting messages all circulating around. Like we can't expect people to have full-time jobs like us just researching what to do. And so I think it's really important that the message comes across clear to consumers, so that way we can have this sort of cradle to cradle, or some sort of circularity in terms of the end of life. So do you have any?
I do. Yeah. So let me tell you a short story.
Okay.
There was a small village by a riverside, very peaceful, a lot of very committed people. And one day, somebody saw a baby floating down the river. And a group of people jumped into the boat and took the boat out into the river and rescued the baby. And then there were a few more babies. And so they set up a baby watch, and people started having shifts of people that were going out and rescuing babies. And then there were more babies. And so they started thinking about technology solutions. Maybe they could do nets, maybe they could do sensors so that they would have an early warning system. And as the problem increased, eventually somebody headed up the river. And the people in the village said, what are you doing? We need to be rescuing babies. And that person said, no, we need to be finding out who's throwing babies in the river.
Right.
From my perspective, recycling is going to fail because of the inherent complexity of it, and because any technology solution is going to be a niche solution. Coca-Cola can get to a place where they're using post-consumer content from an incredibly capital-intensive, complicated system based in large urban areas of industrialized countries. And that's still not going to reach 80% of the global population. So my goal is to cut recycling out of the equation for packaging, and to do that through a combination of reuse and composting and better product design. And like in Portland, make it, like in Seattle, make it a really simple choice. One of the things in the back end that I didn't talk about, California has a mandate for zero waste by 2020. Nowhere near happening. California has a legal mandate for every jurisdiction to compost. There are no penalties. Almost no jurisdiction is composting. The ones that are composting aren't accepting pizza boxes because pizza boxes have food sold paper. Seattle, it all composts. Portland, if I have it, it goes in compost. The choice is very simple. And so to the extent that the solution that we're trying to work towards is, can we intervene high enough up the food chain that by the time it gets to you and I, it's really simple and it's going to work. And I think that means compostable and reusable, and not really, if in my perfect world, I wouldn't be recycling any of this stuff.
Yeah, so just a short last response to that. I agree with you 100%, and actually I'm writing a paper on that exact topic right now, how we do need to go higher up the food chain. Yeah, so I'd like to exchange contact info, maybe talk more about that. But yeah, I do think there needs to be some sort of solution in the meantime during this transition time before we get all of the companies to change their ways. We should salvage what's already been ruined, is my opinion. But anyway, I've spoken too much.
And you know, again, we're trying to intervene at a place where, as those solutions are emerging, the people who have to make those procurement decisions know what's available, and it's been vetted, and they know where they can get it. And if we can start to do that on a regional scale, we have a replicable model.
Cool. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks, Rachel. I think next Marco and then Felipe.
Hi there, Kevin. Thanks for the talk. This was very interesting, especially to somebody who's not a plastics person at all. So I would like to ask you a question. It seems, in a highly simplified way, that the main problem with the plastics is that they are either bad for the environment or bad for our health, or both. And we want to avoid that happening. And some of these plastics are a lot worse in that regard than others. Some of them break down to molecular level, some of them don't, some of them don't do anything at all, and a lot of them are somewhere in between. Is there, to your knowledge, any municipality or any country or any region where there have been efforts to basically put some sort of an eco tax on the wrong types of plastic? And if you use the wrong type of plastic in your packaging, you will have to pay more, and basically it makes it more expensive for a consumer to buy any product which is in the wrong type of packaging. And it might encourage them to go more towards the other packaging, which is maybe more, which is possibly better, but which might be more expensive to create, and therefore sort of equilibrizes or levels off the costs to the consumer. And then you get to something which in a stereotypical view for the Americans would say money talks, which would go down very well with the Americans. So do you know if that has been tried and basically just failed, or hasn't been tried?
I know of no jurisdiction where that's been tried. It's an interesting approach, and I think in the long run, a good one. I have a couple things to say about it. First of all, what I would hope is that if what we're doing has some success, one of the biggest problems that we have is that local governments, at least, and local governments, at least, and in the case of California, which tends to be remarkably unsophisticated about a lot of this, even at a state level, they don't know very much. And so part of what we're doing is trying to come up with vetted solutions for
it's pretty tough to do that, but you really want like
wholesale buyers. But we're also trying to do this to inform local governments so that if they're doing something like an ordinance that says you have to use compostable products, and then they
That's
can
the class.
specify exactly what that is, and they can,
Not
when somebody says,
anybody.
"What is that?" they can give you a list of products. So the kind of work we're talking about is necessary for making that happen.
I'm an actors group.
Part of the problem is that,
And that's why he got
need to
like his
think about
other.
what the side effects are, because in a lot of cities in the West Coast, there's a 25-cent tax on non-reusable bags, and that's just a revenue stream for the stores. They get to keep it. One of our proposals to the city for funding our project is to have some of those stores voluntarily give that money to an effort to identify products that are good. The complication is that because you've got products coming in from tens of thousands of different manufacturers who source their plastic in tens of thousands of different places, it will take a while to effectively implement something like that. I think it is an excellent idea and an excellent avenue. I think we have a lot of homework to do first. And hopefully what we're doing starts that.
Right. Thank you.
Felipe?
Okay, many thanks. I'm Felipe. I'm from South America. I'm very happy to be here. We are focusing in the same line that you presented to us. And I want to ask two things. The first one is maybe for later. If you have some examples of policies for regulation of plastics and banning, it will be great. And here in Latin America, as you may know, we have another reality, and we have a lot of informality with the waste pickers. So they know very well the amount of different types of plastic, and they also know the market. So they know very well how is the diversity and variability of the prices. And material is recyclable when there is a market. So here we have that reality as well. And the other one is about incineration, because it's challenging here. The lobby of incineration want to enter to the municipal solid waste management here in South America. And I want to know about in what moment incineration is not more economically viable.
So
If we are looking to an scenario of less plastic, so the amount of rejects or residues to be incinerated is going to have less plastic, so less calorific power.
okay. So let me, first of all, for your first question, I didn't quite catch the question in there. So you were saying that there's a lot of informal relationships and a lot of different plastics. So
yeah, I started with examples, but looking also with our reality. Examples of policies for banning plastic.
You're looking for model policies.
Yes.
Okay. So let's stay in touch, and I can talk to you more about that. Incineration is really interesting. It's used a lot in Europe as an alternative. It's also used in the United States. There are two problems with it. One is that every incinerator is custom designed. It's custom engineered. And it's custom engineered specifically, it's optimized for a specific waste stream composition, a specific ratio of different types of plastics, different types of paper, food, other types of waste. And it will not operate very well unless that is the mix that it gets. And so when you contract with someone to build an incinerator, you are locking yourself in to the mix of trash that you have now. You cannot change it. You cannot implement recycling. And a lot of the things that provide the most energy in an incinerator are exactly the kinds of things that you might want to recycle, like plastic and paper. So once you've done that, you've closed off any future options. The second problem is that many of those materials that you're burning, particularly plastics, particularly a class of plastics called halogenated plastics, polyvinyl chloride, which incredibly to me is used in the United States for food grade and water applications. I hope Europe doesn't do that. I don't think they do, but I'll bet Latin America does. And Teflon, which is based on fluorine, polyvinyl chloride is based on chlorine. Halogenated plastics produce dioxins and other materials that are toxic in parts per billion. And you see it in paper production because you use chlorine for paper bleaching. And you see it in incinerators along with a bunch of other toxics. It forms in the smokestack, so you can't really control it before you combust it. It is very difficult to capture in the stack. So you are basically spewing incredibly toxic materials over the landscape for the life of your incinerator, and you can't change it because otherwise the incinerator won't work. There are situations where I think incineration as an act of desperation is probably the only choice that that policymakers have. It is pretty much the last thing that I would do. And, you know, again, I come from Seattle where we had that choice, we made a different choice, and we've never looked back.
I think Esther wanted to share some comments as well.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. So I will stay in touch.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to you more. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Many thanks.
Hello, Kevin.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you very much for untangling some messy scenarios about the bio-based materials that are not bio-based, etc. Very good. Thank you. Just a comment, and it's a question, but it's about the source of the problems. Yeah, I know your presentation is the source of the problem.
Okay.
The problem of plastics. Yeah, the source of raw materials. Of course, the United States and Brazil. I am from Brazil. Are big bioethanol producers. You produce it from corn, and you know, and we from sugarcane. And as you know, the problem for bio-based energy and waste materials are the markets. Yeah. For instance, the investments. For instance, the investments are still to fossil fuels, fossil materials, of course. And I know, because I know the person from Berkeley, from California, Berkeley, David Zilberman, that he is a big guy, a big professor too, like you. And we are always talking about why, kind of action, who and what kind of action could be done to change this market orientation, because we have now the strong oil and gas trajectories. For instance, we have the relationship between waste and energy and waste, yeah? From the perspective of incineration or pyrolysis that generates energy, of course. You have the plasma technologies to use. It's a more robust and more complicated and sophisticated process, yeah, to use plastics, but not only. For instance, waste from electronics, that is a big problem too. Yeah? So at least, what do you think about the source of the problem? Why do not we have a bioethanol and alcochemical trajectories for plastics?
Lot of parts to that. Let me try and unwind some pieces of it, and then if I'm not capturing some of the things you want to talk about, I'm happy to circle back. Brazil is interesting because it wasn't a big oil producer. It was put in a position where if it wanted to have some self-reliance, it needed to find alternatives. And so Brazil was a leader in the development of bio-based alcohol, which is not cheap. But if your goal is energy security, then it was worth doing. And Brazil was actually a leader in a lot of ways. And the problem with Brazil was that basically it led to the energy balance on corn ethanol is terrible. You are losing energy converting it to a liquid fuel. But if you are scaling it up, then and you're in a situation where you can avoid the external cost of destroying huge parts of the Amazon rainforest to have factory farms to produce environmentally and financially dubious products, you will do that. And so part of the problem is a failure of government policy. Part of the problem is a neoliberal cultural perspective that assumes that random corporations who do not factor the long-term survival and prosperity of civilization into their calculation are still going to make the right decision, and that not synchronizing or coordinating or optimizing those decisions is just fine. Markets are great for some situations. These are not those situations. There are some other ways of dealing with plastic that I think are interesting niche applications. At one point, we were working with an organization in Santa Cruz that had gotten access to a pilot technology for reducing plastics to high-grade diesel fuel. The energy balance is very promising. It's a low-temperature process. It's basically a bunch of pipes. You could build these things anywhere in the world that has a machine shop. So the process is very simple. And the temperatures are low enough that you could provide some of the energy, at least with solar. And you could scale it from a tabletop to something that is pretty good sized. And the problem with it makes sense in a situation where you have a small village that has to bring in all of their fuel by truck or by boat that has a lot of plastic waste, where you can take it and turn it into a product that you need. But it's a niche application. If the government isn't going to act at any level, then the only thing you can try and do is assemble an aggregation of players in the supply chain who are interested in doing the right thing, either because that's politically what people want to be doing, or because there's some recognition at some level. And at the end of the day, it is disheartening. But if I didn't think there was a way we could do this, I would be drinking heavily on a beach somewhere. As long as I can see a glide path out of here, what I'm looking for is where the leverage is. And I think that's our challenge. Yeah. And where on the scale of countries to individuals and from manufacturers to end users, where are the places where we can assemble the networks that can actually identify and influence how that system works over time. Did I answer the question, or is there something else?
Well, it's a big problem concerning market entry barriers, and there is a lot of efforts on research and development for alcochemicals, for plastics and other new bio-based materials. But I think the global market must change, and this is not this is a long-term goal. we have to choose that.
Brazil could be a global leader in producing PHA.
Yeah, for instance. But now we are facing a very dark scenario, governmental and political. So including the return of Amazonian burns. It's the hell.
Yeah.
I can talk about this because it's not very good.
Well, I'd love to talk to you more about that, because I would assume in Brazil that there are some very smart people that are articulating what the glide path could look like if Brazil.
And we have technological and innovation solutions. Not only Brazil, but the Scandinavian countries, Germany, of course, the United States, concerning those efforts on research and development. But the market barriers are now very strong.
Right, but the good news is this: that we don't have to wait for some technological miracle to come along in 20 years and save us. We actually do know how to do this now if we want to.
Thanks, Esther.
Yeah, thank you.
I think Kevin wanted to say something about the medical sector. Kevin, do you want to unmute yourself? Kevin Winter.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much indeed, Kevin, for a really insightful presentation. There's lots going on here, and in terms of understanding some of the part confusion, but also those who are taking such an advantage of the way in which these packaging and has occurred in the past and continues to do so. I just raised a question in the chat box here saying, you know, and given the fact, of course, there's a pandemic and we're now much more concerned around health issues. I've never seen in my own country a conversation around how plastics in particular are being driven through research within the health sector. And I think there is one sector that probably has an enormous amount of influence, both in the context right now worldwide, but I'm looking for these, not looking necessarily for these silver bullets, but we know a whole lot, as you said just now. We're just not seemingly changing the system and finding key drivers to bring about fundamental change. Where is the health sector's voice in this? And maybe your research has determined quite a lot of that already.
Part of the problem is that it's very specialized, and people like me don't know very much about it. And because it's about health and contamination, it's very difficult to venture into it because you don't want to be creating a public health risk. There's a side piece to this, and I want to circle back to what you're saying. One of the discouraging, where we are right now is where we were in January. We were just beginning these conversations. Coronavirus kicked in, everything stopped. And we're only now starting to try and reconnect with everybody. There's been this fascinating dynamic. There was a thread in the plastics industry when cities started to try and ban single-use materials and promote reusable shopping bags. The plastics industry sponsored a series of studies that showed that reusable shopping bags are a source of filth and disease and a health hazard. And those studies were re-invoked when the plastics industry came in at the beginning of the coronavirus crisis and basically started repealing, for public health reasons, the use of reusable bags in stores. And it's also put a dent in reusable items in restaurants. And basically it's rolled back reusable and basically reusability replacing single-use disposable products. So there's that aspect of it, and we basically are going to have to come back from that. I assume that we are going to at some point. But the health industry in particular, a lot of the same material and product design things that I'm talking about apply in that industry as well. And a lot of the same opportunities apply as well. A lot of what we're talking about is single-use items. And a lot of the single-use items do not pose enough of a contamination hazard that we have to treat them as biological waste. So I think the opportunity is there. It takes product designers who are thinking in terms of how to reduce single-use plastic waste in the medical industry. So I think the potential is there, partly because it's so emotionally loaded, partly because there's a public health aspect to it, partly because it's specialized. I don't know who those people are. I think we need to find them.
I think Dan had a comment that there is a difference between the healthcare industry and health impacts, so health risks. So keep that in mind, but we had Anna, and then whoever is raising in his hand or her hand under Galaxy S9. So Anna first, and then the next person with the Galaxy S9.
Yeah, hello, Kevin. Yeah, thank you so much for your amazing presentation. And I think it's very important to discuss different difficulties in this area. My question is it will be easy to do action bottom up than we up bottom action? You know, for example, to reduce consumerism, to invest to education, to educate people and children, to raise a new generation with completely different thoughts. And also, for example, reducing packaging at all. Because for many people, when we go to
Sorry, but I can hear you. Sorry.
Kevin will repeat the question if he heard it.
I kind of heard it. So Anna, I'm going to try and say back what I think, or you want to try again? I think what you're asking is what's the potential for education?
No, not only about education, but for example, right now we are talking a lot about plastic pollution, plastic problems. But it seems it's nothing happened. We just stay in the same point.
Right.
Is it
right.
possibility? It will be much easier to move when we do bottom-up actions, like from consumers. And
okay.
For example, refusing plastic packaging, educating our children how to about this problem, and also, for example, for sorting household waste. Why I asking about this? Because I run a project with my partners from Kenya, Egypt, and Turkey, and we work it with children and parents, and it's called Educate, and it was about inspiring younger generation with circular economy. And we found out that most children and parents, they really worry about all the situation, plastic and other pollutions, and circular economy, and they really want to change. But for very difficult to fight for this system. Yeah.
Okay.
You know,
so,
to do that, as you mentioned, labeling is completely misleading. People don't understand how to face because it's not clear. If it's recyclable plastic or not.
Right. So your question is let me try again. Okay. You're saying that a bottom-up approach is necessary. I absolutely agree.
Yes. Yeah.
If there was not a broad awareness that is a couple of generations deep by now, that we have to do something, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And now the question is, why, despite all of that, is nothing happening? Why is it not sufficient? Okay? And part of it is that, as we've seen, it's easy to use terms interchangeably that aren't the same, to be imprecise in ways that have significant consequences, degradable versus biodegradable. bioplastic versus compostable plastic at 60 degrees Celsius versus biodegradable in real life, in real composting situations. Compostable, but it's got toxics on it. Basically, in my policy experience, given enough pressure from the bottom up or from the top down or from a fundamental conceptual shift, the kind of dominant economic corporate powers, and this isn't a conspiracy theory, this is just business, will tend to do the minimum necessary to appear to be doing something. On the public sector, if you can latch on to the cult of the individual, or there's going to be a technology fix, or what these guys are telling us is the solution, even though if you dig into it, it's not. Because that's easier than making the long-term investment that we're going to need to make to fundamentally shift the vector that we're on. Some public entities, they tend to be ones that have a lot more civic engagement, are a lot more sophisticated and motivated to come up with lasting solutions than others. And again, I was spoiled. I worked for agencies that were like that, and the agencies that I'm seeing here are shockingly not like that. I was actually pretty surprised. But in all of those cases, what people need is for it to be simple to do the right thing. I think one of the weapons that is used routinely is that it's easy to shame someone if you believe that you're personally responsible and it's happening because you're not doing it right. And a lot of the message that you see to people about the right thing to do, you see articles, well, you know, you thought that was the right thing to do, but it's not. You're doing it wrong. Or here's this new thing you should be doing instead. Well, actually, it turns out there's a problem with that. And people don't have the bandwidth to devote huge parts of their life to constantly trying to do the right thing as individuals. We do the best we can. We want to do good. We all want to do good. So our responsibility is to try and make that as simple to do as possible. And to the extent that we are using that grassroots, ground up awareness to identify where that cultural pressure can be applied to leverage the maximum amount of change at a corporate and a public level, and to not let corporations and public entities that are trying to evade substantive change off the hook. If that bottom-up group went back to Coca-Cola and said, yeah, this part where you're making plastic out of plants instead of oil, we don't care. That part where there's a recycling operation in San Francisco that one of the major recycling corporations in the country owns, that runs infrared scans on every piece of plastic that flows by it and can flip the Coke bottles into the Coke bottle bin. That's not going to fix things. But we need to be able to identify something that can be reduced to a simple, understandable challenge. Where, and it's kind of, if you look at what's going on in the United States right now with George Floyd, this has been going on for at least half a century in this form. This is a good example. And Obama was elected, we were talking about a post-racial society. None of the patterns from the last 50 years had changed. Now that we're in an economic crisis and a political crisis, this incident has triggered a response that coalesces around a pretty simple demand, which is stop doing that. So something like that, I think, is what we're looking for.
Thank you, Kevin. Do we have one last question before we close the webinar? Yes, go ahead,
Hi.
Galaxy.
Hi, Adina. It's Matt from South Africa. Sorry, I'm just using my phone. Thanks, Kevin. It was really interesting. You know, I just want to say what I found most useful and interesting about the presentation was the emphasis that you said in the introduction on social capital and access to that. and also that you contextualize it really in terms of place and space where you are. And so just to do the same thing before I ask you two straightforward questions is, so I'm in South Africa and trying to think of the banning of single-use plastics, which is actually a part of the political debate. Really seeing that happen is a really tall order. And the primary reason for that in my mind is that the main producer of petrochemicals in South Africa is actually, its majority shareholder is the state. So obviously lobbying them would be a tough call. Mm-hmm. So my questions are, and I mean, I'm really interested in your answer to this. I'm not a plastics expert, but in terms of the middle in between approach, between top-down approaches and this cult of the individual that you talked about, I just want to hear from you, what do you mean by that, firstly? And secondly, when you say there is some political willingness where you are to do this, and you said that in the introduction and later on. Okay. You later on said, yeah, it's different. But I'm just wondering, how do you actually measure that when you say talk is cheap? Because obviously in South Africa, talk is very cheap and money is very scarce. So how do you measure that political willingness?
So first of all, is this Sasol in South Africa?
That's right.
What's the company? Sasol? Okay. And Sasol has a long history of environmental devastation under apartheid as well. You know, it's difficult when you have a state. This is a similar problem in Russia. I was at a climate conference in Russia last fall, and this came up a lot. Because you have essentially a corporate interest that doesn't really care, that wants to externalize as much of the cost as possible, and is also a major revenue stream for the state. What I meant by, and what's interesting about it is that if the state made a decision to internalize the environmental damage that their state corporation is causing, then change can happen very quickly. That's the China scenario. The problem is that you have a generations thick embedded corporate culture and state connection that's difficult to unwind. What I mean by middle is that when we make procurement, when the consumer choices that are available are made available at a retail level, those retail entities are buying from wholesale entities. Those wholesale entities are buying from producers or suppliers. And those suppliers are buying from producers and manufacturers. And the question is, where's the point politically where you can have enough influence on political decisions and policies that a motivated network of individuals and groups can change decisions on a public level, on a subnational public level. One of the first things I did out of college was help with, along with 1,000 or so other people, was help bring down the largest nuclear construction program in the world in the Pacific Northwest. They were going to build 26 nuclear power plants, one of which is operating today. And we could do that because I lived in a state with 4 million people that had a very strong identity as a state and as a bioregion. And it was small enough that the social network of influencers was fairly small. And that's basically what we're trying to do here in Monterey Bay. So so basically, where's the leverage where you can actually you can help coalesce a network that can influence on a level that is either too small, but you could replicate it in a lot of places, or large enough that if you pull it off at that level, you have an example of how to get it right. So far, where we are with what we're doing is that a lot of that is based on making sure that that we understand how that system works, where the leverage points are, where the leverage points that we can have an influence on are, and some effective ways to solve the problem that we're trying to solve, because a lot of that information simply isn't available. And it is like climate in the sense that even if we know what we need to do, in 1990, there was a movement in the United States called the no regret strategy, where we basically said, look, half of what we need to do to slow down climate change is cheaper than free. Let's do that half. We can argue about how big a problem it is later. We had political sign-off from George Bush 1. We had political sign-off at a federal level to do that. Bill Clinton didn't have the courage to follow through, so it fell apart. But we had a moment where we had a broad consensus at a level where we could have made a fundamental decision to do the right thing, and the world would be a vastly better place if we had taken that path. We got close enough that it was worth the try. And have you dealt with Sasol directly?
I have not.
Do you know people who deal with Sasol directly on any level? Even their PR?
Yes, I do.
Okay, I think where I would start is to try and have a conversation. You know, they have sustainability reps who are symbolic, some of whom are marketing hacks. I imagine that some of them are actually dedicated, sincere people who are appalled by what's happening. And if it were me in that situation, I'd be trying to identify those people and have some long conversations over a beer about what it would take to leverage that change in Sasol and in the government, and who the people are that you should be either harassing or influencing, depending on, you know, basically the tactic is you either make them really uncomfortable or you give them an out that makes them and everybody else look good. I'd be trying to build that network of, the middle level is basically trying to figure out local and, you know, urban and regional governments that have some freedom to move and influencing things there, building constituencies from the bottom up where wholesalers and suppliers can actually respond with alternatives, and then at the same time trying to figure out where the political leverage is to apply political pressure if you can make this a front burner issue, which for Africa around climate, it's going to be. Africa is one of the countries that is on the short list for things breaking down fast if they don't change their vector.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kevin. And I think, you know, we have a lot of food for thought and possibly things to act upon. So I'd like everybody to thank Kevin again. We will put the recording online, and I will also put Kevin's contact with his permission, so people who want to continue this conversation will be able to follow through.
Dina, if you could also, if you'll post a link for the PowerPoint, I will also post one on our website, but if you can send it to people. And then I'd love to hear from all of you. Please email me if you want to have a conversation. Let's talk more.
Yeah,
thank
you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, and stay safe. And thanks, Kevin.
All right. Take care, you guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Cheers.